Tonight we're going to step back over 3,000 years to discover the hidden gardens of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs walked among lotus flowers and common people grew vegetables that fed entire cities. These weren't just patches of dirt with a few plants. They were carefully planned spaces that brought peace, food, and spiritual connection to one of history's greatest civilizations. We'll explore actual archaeological discoveries, read translations from ancient papyrus scrolls, and uncover how these gardens shaped daily life along the Nile. Before we go back in time together, if you're enjoying settling in for the night with a bit of Egyptian history, consider hitting subscribe. And I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Have you ever wondered what the very first gardens in human history actually looked like? Not the wild forests or natural meadows, but the first spaces where people deliberately chose which plants to grow, where to place them, and how to make them thrive in harmony. The answer to that question lay buried under Egyptian sand for thousands of years, waiting for archaeologists to brush away the dust and reveal something extraordinary. In 1922, everyone was talking about Howard Carter's discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb. But something equally fascinating was happening at other dig sites across Egypt. Archaeologists were finding something that didn't glitter like gold or shine like precious jewels, but told us something profound about how ancient Egyptians lived. They were finding gardens, or more precisely, the remains of gardens, preserved in ways that let us see exactly what had been planted there over 3 millennia ago. At Amarna, the city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten around 1346 BCE, excavators found something remarkable in the 1,980 seconds. They discovered the layout of residential gardens, complete with the remains of planting holes, irrigation channels, and even some preserved seeds. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't royal gardens. They belonged to ordinary officials and workers. The ancient Egyptians, it turned out, were a nation of gardeners, from the highest priest to the simplest labourer. Let me paint you a picture of what these gardens actually looked like, based on real evidence. Imagine walking down a dusty street in ancient Thebes on a hot afternoon. The sun beats down mercilessly, as it still does in Luxor today. You're heading toward a house, and as you approach, you notice something that immediately makes the air feel cooler. There's a high mud brick wall, painted white to reflect the heat. You step through a wooden door, and suddenly, everything changes. Before you is a rectangular garden, maybe 30 feet long and 20 feet wide. The first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you feel. The temperature has dropped noticeably. The air smells of earth and flowers and water. You can hear the gentle sound of water trickling into a small pond. After the harsh street outside, this feels like entering another world entirely. The garden is organized in a way that would make perfect sense to any modern gardener. There's a small rectangular pond or pool right in the center, maybe 10 feet long. This isn't just decorative, though it certainly is beautiful. This is the garden's life source, the reservoir that holds water for irrigation. Around its edges, you can see lotus flowers floating, their pink and white blooms opening to the afternoon sun. The ancient Egyptians called the lotus session, and they saw it as a symbol of rebirth because it closed at night and reopened each morning. Now, how do we know all this detail? Archaeologists found actual garden pools at multiple sites. At the palace complex of Amenhotep III at Malkata, excavators discovered a burket, a garden pool, that was over 1,000 feet long. They found the clay lining that made it watertight, still intact after more than 3,000 years. Around smaller pools in residential gardens, they found post holes showing where shade structures had been built, places where families could sit in the evening and enjoy the cool air. But the pools weren't the only water feature. Leading away from each pool, archaeologists found narrow channels, carefully shaped and lined with clay. These were irrigation ditches, and they were surprisingly sophisticated. The ancient Egyptians understood gravity and water flow. They built their gardens with a very slight slope, barely noticeable to the eye, but enough that water would flow from the central pool through these channels to every corner of the garden. Some channels even had small clay gates that could be opened or closed to direct water to specific areas. Around these water features, the ancient Egyptians planted in organized rows and beds. We know this because excavators found the actual planting holes arranged in geometric patterns. At some sites, like the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, they found these holes still contained traces of the plants that had grown there. Using a technique called archaeobotany, scientists can identify ancient plants from tiny fragments of wood, seeds, or even pollen that survived in the dry Egyptian soil. What did they find? The list is both familiar and exotic. There were date palms, of course. The date palm was the superstar of the Egyptian garden. It provided sweet fruit that could be eaten fresh or dried for storage. Its wood was used for building. Its leaves were woven into baskets, mats, and sandals. And crucially, its tall trunk and spreading fronds provided shade for smaller plants growing beneath. At Amarna, botanists identified the remains of over 40 date palms in a single large garden. Beneath the palms, there were fruit trees. The ancient Egyptians grew pomegranates, a fruit they called inhemen. The pomegranate came to Egypt from Persia, probably during the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, and Egyptians fell in love with it. The fruit represented fertility and abundance. Archaeologists found pomegranate seeds in tombs, left as offerings for the dead to enjoy in the afterlife. In one garden at Thebes, they found a concentration of pomegranate seeds near what had been a tree planting hole, giving us a precise location where a pomegranate tree had grown and dropped its fruit 3,000 years ago. Fig trees were everywhere in Egyptian gardens. The sycamore fig, specifically, which the Egyptians called nehet. This wasn't the same fig you might buy at a grocery store today. It was a species native to Africa. These trees grew huge, with massive spreading branches that created pools of deep shade. The wood was valuable for furniture and coffins. The fruit was sweet and could be eaten fresh or dried. But perhaps most importantly, the sycamore fig was sacred to the goddess Hathor, who was sometimes called Lady of the Sycamore. Planting one in your garden wasn't just practical, it was an act of devotion. Then there were the grapevines. Egypt's wine industry goes back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, and many middle-class homes had small vineyards right in their gardens. Archaeologists found the remains of grape arbors, wooden structures that supported growing vines, at multiple sites. The arbors served double duty, providing both fruit and additional shade. Workers could eat grapes fresh during harvest, dry them into raisins for year-round eating, or crush them for wine. The ancient Egyptians were serious about their wine. They even labelled their wine jars with information about the vineyard, the year, and the winemaker, just like modern wine bottles. In the sunny spots, where full light reached the ground, vegetable gardens flourished. This is where the garden became truly practical, where it transitioned from beautiful to essential. The ancient Egyptian diet was heavily plant-based, not for philosophical reasons, but because meat was expensive and required resources that most families couldn't afford regularly. The garden provided the food that kept families healthy. They grew onions, lots and lots of onions. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, remarked on how much Egyptians loved onions. He wrote about reading an inscription on the Great Pyramid that described the onions, radishes, and garlic given to workers during its construction. Whether or not he read that inscription correctly is debated, but the sentiment was true. Onions were a staple food. Archaeologists have found onion remains at sites across Egypt, and artwork from tomb walls shows bundles of onions being presented as offerings. Garlic grew alongside the onions. Like onions, garlic was both food and medicine. Ancient Egyptian medical texts, preserved on papyrus scrolls, prescribe garlic for various ailments. The Immerse papyrus, a medical document from around 1550 BCE, that's now housed in Leipzig University Library, lists garlic as a treatment for heart problems, tumours, worms, and bites. Whether it actually cured these conditions is questionable, but the ancient Egyptians believed it did, and they planted it in quantity. Lettuce was another garden staple, but not the lettuce you're probably thinking of. Ancient Egyptian lettuce was a variety called romaine, tall with long leaves. But here's something interesting about how the Egyptians viewed lettuce. They associated it with the god Min, a fertility deity. Why? Because when you cut a stem of this lettuce variety, it releases a white sap that ancient Egyptians thought resembled semen. So lettuce became a symbol of fertility and reproduction. Offering lettuce to the god Min was a way to pray for children or for success in growing crops. Gardens weren't just about food or beauty. They were spaces where the practical, the aesthetic, and the spiritual all mixed together. Cucumbers thrived in Egyptian gardens. The hot climate was perfect for them. Ancient texts mention cucumbers, and seeds have been found at archaeological sites. The Israelites, according to the biblical book of Numbers, complained in the desert after leaving Egypt, remembering sadly the cucumbers they had eaten there. For a people wandering in a wilderness, those cool, watery Egyptian cucumbers must have seemed like paradise. Now, let's talk about flowers, because Egyptian gardens weren't just about food production. Beauty mattered deeply to the ancient Egyptians, and they cultivated flowers with as much care as they did vegetables. The lotus we mentioned earlier wasn't just growing in the central pool. Egyptians also planted blue lotuses, which were actually water lilies, in any water feature they had. These flowers were sacred and symbolic. The blue lotus appears in countless pieces of Egyptian art. At banquets, guests are shown holding lotus flowers to their noses, breathing in the scent. Some scholars believe the blue lotus had mild narcotic properties when consumed, creating a pleasant, relaxed feeling. Whether that's true or not, we know Egyptians treasured these flowers. Papyrus grew in the wetter areas of gardens. This wasn't just the plant that gave us paper, though that was certainly important. Papyrus thickets represented Lower Egypt itself. The plant was a symbol of the Delta region. Having papyrus in your garden was a way of bringing a piece of the northern marshlands to your home, no matter where in Egypt you lived. The tall, green stalks with their feathery heads swaying in the breeze must have been a beautiful sight, reminding people of the wild wetlands along the Nile. Cornflowers, those brilliant blue flowers, grew in Egyptian gardens too. We know this because archaeologists found dried cornflowers in Tutankhamun's tomb, woven into the floral collar that was draped over his mummy. Someone, perhaps a family member or a devoted servant, had picked these flowers from a garden and included them in the young king's burial. 3,000 years later, when Howard Carter opened the tomb, those flowers were still recognizably blue. It's one of the most touching details from that famous discovery, the idea that someone had wanted to send the teenage pharaoh into the afterlife with fresh garden flowers. Mandrake plants grew in some gardens, valued for their sweet-selling fruit and their supposed magical properties. The ancient Egyptians called mandrake Remet, and they believed it had powers related to love and fertility. The fruit appears in love poetry from ancient Egypt. In one poem preserved on papyrus, a young woman speaks of going to her lover's garden where mandrakes spread their scent. These weren't just gardens. They were settings for romance, for the private moments of life that every human culture values. As evening approached in an ancient Egyptian garden, the space would transform. The harsh sunlight would soften. The lotus flowers would begin to close. Birds would come to the garden pool to drink, swallows and hoopoes, and the occasional heron if the pool was large enough. The air would fill with the evening song of insects. This was when families would come out to enjoy their garden, when the work of the day was done and the cooling air made it pleasant to sit outside. We know they did this because of the furniture archaeologists have found. At several sites, they discovered stone seats built into garden walls, permanent benches where people could sit and enjoy the view. At more affluent homes, there were pavilions, small structures with roofs, supported by columns but open on the sides, where families could recline on cushions and eat evening meals while looking out over their garden. The wealthy even had garden chapels, small shrines dedicated to household gods, placed right in the garden where daily prayers and offerings could be made surrounded by growing things. The archaeological evidence for these gardens is remarkably detailed. At Amarna, the excavation team created a complete map of the city's gardens based on what they found in the soil. They could see which neighbourhoods had large gardens and which had small ones. They could track how garden sizes correlated with house sizes and presumably with wealth and social status. They found that even the smallest houses, those belonging to the poorest workers, had some garden space, even if it was just a few square feet with a couple of vegetable plants and maybe a small tree. This tells us something important about ancient Egyptian culture. Gardens weren't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. They were considered essential to a good life. Every person, regardless of status, deserved to have some connection to growing things, to have a small space where they could create life and beauty. In a desert environment where most of the land was bare rock and sand, where the thin strip of fertile land along the Nile was all that made life possible, gardens were a statement of hope and determination. They said, "We are here. We will make this place bloom. We will create abundance even in the desert." Chapter 2. The Sacred Science of Ancient Egyptian Horticulture. How did ancient Egyptians actually make gardens grow in one of the harshest climates on Earth? That's the question that puzzled archaeologists and botanists for years. After all, most of Egypt gets less than an inch of rain per year. Cairo gets about an inch, Luxor gets virtually nothing, and Aswan might go years without a single drop. Yet somehow, 3,000 years ago, without modern irrigation systems, without garden hoses or sprinkler systems, Egyptians maintained lush gardens that would make any modern gardener jealous. The answer lies in the Nile River, but not in the way you might think. Everyone knows the Nile was important to Egypt. That much is obvious. But the relationship between the river and Egyptian gardens was incredibly sophisticated, based on thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. The ancient Egyptians were scientists, even if they didn't use that word. They watched, they recorded, they tested, and they perfected techniques that modern agriculturists still study and admire. Let's start with the inundation, the annual flood that was the heartbeat of Egyptian civilization. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile would begin to rise in June. Water levels would climb steadily through the summer months, reaching their peak in September. The river would spread across its floodplain, covering the fields with water that was rich with silt carried down from the highlands of Ethiopia. Then, gradually, the waters would recede, leaving behind a layer of fresh, fertile mud. By November, the fields would be ready for planting. This cycle governed all of Egyptian life. The Egyptians even divided their year according to it. They had 3 seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Peret, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. Each season lasted 4 months. The entire calendar revolved around the behaviour of the river. This wasn't just practical, it was deeply religious. The flood was the god Hapi, depicted as a well-fed man with pendulous breasts, representing the river's fertility and abundance. The return of the flood each year was celebrated with festivals and offerings. But here's what's fascinating from a gardening perspective. While farmers relied on the natural flooding to water their fields, gardeners couldn't. Garden plants needed consistent moisture all year round, not just during the flood season. A vegetable garden or an orchard needed water in January and February and March, long after the flood had receded. So, how did gardeners solve this problem? They built storage systems. The garden pools we talked about earlier weren't just decorative features, they were precisely engineered water storage devices. Archaeologists studying these pools found that they were typically between 3 and 5 feet deep, carefully lined with clay to prevent leakage, and sized according to the garden they served. A mathematical relationship existed between pool size and garden size, suggesting that Egyptian gardeners had calculated how much water they needed to store to keep their plants alive between waterings. But filling those pools was hard work. The Nile water level dropped significantly during the dry season, often 10 or 15 feet below the level of the garden. You couldn't just scoop up water easily. You had to lift it, and lifting water is exhausting work. This is where Egyptian engineering got clever. The shadoof is one of humanity's oldest machines, and it was the backbone of Egyptian garden irrigation. If you visit Egypt today, you can still see shadoofs in use in rural areas, unchanged for thousands of years. It's a simple device, but brilliantly effective. Imagine a long wooden pole, maybe 12 to 15 feet long, mounted on a vertical post so it can pivot like a seesaw. On one end of the pole, you hang a bucket on a rope. On the other end, you attach a counterweight, usually a large lump of mud or a stone. Here's how it worked. The gardener would pull down on the bucket end, lowering it to the water. The bucket would fill, becoming heavy. Then, instead of having to lift that heavy bucket using pure muscle power, the gardener would release it slightly, and the counterweight on the other end would do most of the lifting work. With just a little guidance, the bucket would rise up, water and all. The gardener would swing the pole to the side and empty the bucket into an irrigation channel, then repeat, over and over. We know the shadoof was used in gardens because it appears in tomb paintings. One famous scene from the tomb of Ipuy at Deir el-Medina, dating to about 1275 BCE, shows a man operating a shadoof in a garden, lifting water from a pool to water trees. The painting is so detailed you can see the rope, the bucket, the counterweight, even the splashing water. These tomb paintings weren't random decoration. They were meant to show activities the deceased person wanted to continue doing in the afterlife. The fact that tending a garden with a shadoof was important enough to depict in a tomb tells us how much Egyptians valued this work. For larger operations, like watering the extensive gardens of temples or palaces, the Egyptians eventually developed the sakia, a water wheel turned by oxen. But that came later. Probably not until the Ptolemaic period after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. For most of ancient Egyptian history, for most home gardens, the shadoof was the technology that made everything possible. Once the water was lifted to garden level, distribution was a matter of careful planning. Those clay-lined irrigation channels we mentioned earlier were laid out in specific patterns. The most common pattern was a grid. Main channels ran from the central pool toward the 4 edges of the garden. Smaller channels branched off from these, reaching every planted area. Small clay dams could be placed in channels to block water flow, directing it elsewhere, or removed to let water through. It was like a network of tiny rivers that the gardener controlled completely. The timing of watering was something Egyptian gardeners understood deeply. They knew that watering at midday, in the full heat of the sun, was wasteful. Much of the water would evaporate before it could soak into the soil. So they watered in the early morning or, more commonly, in the evening. Tomb paintings show garden watering happening in the evening light, when shadows are long. This wasn't just practical, it was also pleasant. Working in a garden during the cool of evening, after the oppressive heat of the day, must have been one of life's reliable comforts. Soil management was another area where ancient Egyptians excelled. The silt deposited by the flood was naturally rich in nutrients, but gardeners didn't just rely on that. They improved their soil deliberately. Archaeological excavations of garden sites have found that the soil composition is different from the surrounding natural soil. It's darker, richer, and contains materials that aren't naturally present. What did they add? Organic matter, primarily. Kitchen waste, animal manure, and plant debris were composted and added to gardens. We know this because excavators have found ancient trash heaps, and when they analyze what's in them, they find far less organic material than you'd expect. The plant waste, the food scraps, the animal dung, it's not in the trash heaps because it was being collected and used in gardens. The ancient Egyptians were composting thousands of years before it became a trendy environmental practice. Specific types of fertilizer were valued. Pigeon manure was considered excellent, rich in nitrogen. Wealthy Egyptians built pigeon towers, dovecotes, which served a dual purpose. Pigeons were raised for food, and their droppings were collected for the garden. These towers were architectural features of many estates. Archaeologists have excavated several, finding the small nesting boxes built into the walls and the collection chambers below where manure accumulated. It was an elegant closed-loop system. The pigeons ate grain, produced eggs and meat and fertilizer, and the fertilizer grew more grain. Human waste was also used, though this is less frequently discussed in ancient texts. However, from an archaeological perspective, the evidence is clear. Analysis of soil from ancient gardens shows phosphate levels that indicate human waste was being applied as fertilizer. This might seem unpleasant to us, but it was practical and effective. In a pre-industrial society, everything had to be recycled. Nothing was wasted. The ancient Egyptians also understood what we now call crop rotation, though they didn't use that term. They knew that planting the same thing in the same spot year after year would exhaust the soil. In garden plots, they rotated what grew where. One year, onions might occupy a particular bed. The next year, lettuce, then beans. This wasn't written down as a formal system, but we can see it in the archaeological evidence. Analysis of plant remains from different soil layers, representing different years, shows this rotation pattern. They also practiced intercropping, growing different plants together in the same space. This is visible in tomb paintings that show gardens. You see date palms with grapevines growing nearby, and vegetables planted beneath. This wasn't random. Tall plants provided shade for shorter ones. Deep-rooted plants didn't compete with shallow-rooted ones. Certain plant combinations were healthier together, something modern gardeners call companion planting. We can actually read about some of this knowledge in ancient texts. The ancient Egyptians wrote agricultural treatises, though sadly, very few have survived. Most of what we know comes from scattered references in other types of documents. But there's one fascinating source, called the Wilbur Papyrus, housed in the Brooklyn Museum, dating from about 1147 BCE. It's primarily a land survey and tax record, but it contains detailed information about what was planted where, how much water each crop needed, and how the land was managed. Reading between the lines, you can see the sophisticated understanding of agriculture that Egyptian administrators possessed. Another source is the tomb autobiography, texts written on tomb walls describing a person's life and accomplishments. Officials would sometimes boast about agricultural improvements they'd made. One official named Amenemheb, who lived during the reign of Thutmose III, around 1450 BCE, had inscriptions in his tomb describing how he planted gardens and orchards, how he dug wells, and how his careful management made the land flourish. These weren't empty boasts. Archaeological surveys of the area where Amenemheb worked have found evidence of the water management systems he built, still visible in the landscape thousands of years later. Climate was another factor Egyptian gardeners had to manage. Egypt is hot, brutally so in the summer. Temperatures in Luxor regularly exceed 105 degrees Fahrenheit in June and July. Many plants can't survive that kind of heat without protection, so gardeners created microclimates within their gardens. The shade from date palms and sycamore figs wasn't just pleasant for people, it was essential for plants. Under that canopy, temperatures might be 15 or 20 degrees cooler than in full sun. That difference meant life or death for tender vegetables. Reed screens and woven palm frond mats were used to create additional shade. Archaeologists have found the post holes where these temporary structures were erected over garden beds during the hottest months. As summer ended and temperatures dropped, the screens could be removed to let more light in. This kind of seasonal adjustment shows how actively engaged gardeners were with their plants, constantly observing and responding to conditions. Pest management was a constant challenge. Gardens were targets for every insect, bird, and rodent in the area. How did ancient Egyptians protect their crops without modern pesticides? A combination of physical barriers, companion planting, and biological control. Walls around gardens weren't just for privacy, they kept out larger animals like goats and donkeys. For smaller pests, there's evidence that Egyptians used ash and certain plants with strong smells as deterrents. Planting garlic and onions around the garden border seems to have been a common practice, based on the concentration of these plants near garden walls at excavated sites. Cats were valued partly for their pest control abilities. The ancient Egyptians domesticated the African wildcat, and these animals earned their keep by hunting mice and rats that threatened grain stores and gardens. Tomb paintings sometimes show cats in garden settings, sitting under chairs or prowling among plants. These weren't decorative additions to the scene, they were showing reality. Gardens had cats, and those cats had jobs to do. Birds were both pest and resource. Yes, they ate seeds and fruits, but they also ate insects. Egyptian gardeners seemed to understand this balance. Rather than trying to exclude all birds, they tolerated some, particularly insect eaters like swallows and hoopoes. Meanwhile, fruit trees might be protected with netting during harvest season. Fragments of ancient netting have been found at some sites, made from twisted plant fibers, the same basic technology used to protect fruit trees today. The knowledge of plant care was passed down through families. There were no gardening books in the way we have them now, no instruction manuals you could consult. Knowledge was oral, transmitted from parent to child, master to apprentice. This was true of all crafts in ancient Egypt. A boy would work alongside his father in the garden from an early age, learning by watching and doing. A girl would help her mother with harvesting and food preparation, learning which plants were ready to pick and how to process them. But there were also professionals. Temple gardens and palace gardens employed specialist gardeners, people whose full-time job was plant care. These positions could be quite prestigious. We have records of titles like Chief of the Royal Gardens or Overseer of the Garden Workers of Amun. These weren't just manual labourers, they were highly skilled professionals who understood plants, water, soil, and seasonal timing at an expert level. Some of these gardeners travelled between estates, hired for their expertise. Others held permanent positions at temples, maintaining the sacred gardens that surrounded religious complexes. The temple gardens at Karnak, the massive religious complex at Thebes, were legendary. Although the gardens themselves are long gone, buried under later construction or lost to time, we have descriptions and depictions. The temples owned vast lands, and a portion of those lands were dedicated gardens. These grew flowers for religious ceremonies, herbs for incense, and food to support the temple staff. Managing these gardens was a serious responsibility. The gods themselves were believed to walk in these gardens. Every plant had to be perfect, every path swept clean, every pool clear and full. Some of the most detailed information about ancient Egyptian gardens comes from an unexpected source: the ancient Greeks and Romans who visited Egypt. Herodotus, the Greek historian we mentioned earlier, wrote about Egyptian agriculture and horticulture in the 5th century BCE. He described the irrigation systems with wonder. Coming from Greece, where rainfall was more plentiful, he was amazed that Egyptians could grow such abundance with so little rain. He described the system of water-lifting devices and the careful management of flood water. Later, the Greek botanist Theophrastus, who wrote in the 4th century BCE, documented Egyptian plants. His work, Inquiry into Plants, describes species he saw in Egypt, some of which don't exist anywhere else. He was particularly interested in the papyrus plant and how Egyptians cultivated it. His descriptions give us details that purely archaeological evidence can't provide, like how the plants smelled, how quickly they grew, and what conditions they preferred. When the Romans took control of Egypt after the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE, they were equally impressed by Egyptian gardens. Roman writers described the pleasure gardens of Alexandria, the sophisticated urban parks that lined the waterfront of that great city. They wrote about the botanical gardens, where rare plants from across the known world were collected and studied. Egypt, under the Ptolemies and Romans, became a center of botanical knowledge, building on thousands of years of native Egyptian expertise. What's remarkable is that many of these ancient techniques continued to be used unchanged for thousands of years. When Napoleon's expedition arrived in Egypt in 1798, bringing scientists and scholars along with soldiers, those scientists documented agricultural practices that were essentially identical to what had been done in pharaonic times. The shaduf was still in use. Gardens still had central pools with radiating irrigation channels. Farmers still waited for the Nile flood. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the building of the Aswan Dam and the introduction of modern irrigation, that these ancient patterns finally changed. Today, archaeobotanists study ancient Egyptian gardens using high-tech methods. They analyze ancient soil samples for phytoliths, microscopic silica structures from plant cells that survive for thousands of years. Different plants produce distinctively shaped phytoliths, so by examining soil from an ancient garden, scientists can identify what was planted there, even when no other trace remains. They use carbon dating on seeds and wood fragments to determine exact ages. They employ satellite imaging to locate ancient garden sites, since the different soil composition shows up in aerial photographs. One of the most exciting recent developments is the use of environmental DNA, or eDNA. This is the DNA that all living things shed into their environment. It survives in soil, sometimes for thousands of years. By extracting and analyzing eDNA from ancient garden soil, scientists can identify every plant and even animal that was present, creating a complete ecological picture of the garden. This technology is still new, but it's already revealing surprises, showing plants that we didn't know the Egyptians cultivated, suggesting they had access to species from far beyond Egypt's borders. Each discovery adds to our understanding, painting a more detailed picture of how these ancient gardeners worked, what they knew, and what they achieved. They were working with the same basic biological principles we use today. Plants need water, sunlight, nutrients, and protection from extreme conditions. The ancient Egyptians figured out how to provide all of those things in one of Earth's most challenging climates. Their success is a testament to careful observation, patient experimentation, and accumulated knowledge passed down through generations. Chapter 3: Paradise Gardens and the Egyptian Afterlife. What did ancient Egyptians think would happen to their garden when they died? This question might seem odd at first, but it goes right to the heart of how deeply gardens were woven into Egyptian spirituality and beliefs about death and the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, death wasn't an ending. It was a transition to another form of existence, and that existence needed to be supported, provisioned, and made beautiful, just like life on Earth. The concept of the afterlife garden appears in Egyptian religion from the very earliest periods. In the pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings in the world, carved into pyramids from the Old Kingdom period, around 2400 BCE, there are references to the field of reeds, called Aru in Egyptian. This was the Egyptian vision of paradise, and it was explicitly described as a garden, an agricultural paradise, where grain grew higher than anywhere on earth, and where the blessed dead would spend eternity farming and harvesting in perfect abundance. Think about what that tells us. When the ancient Egyptians imagined paradise, they didn't imagine a place of leisure where no work was required. They imagined a perfect garden. They wanted to farm, to grow things, to harvest, but without the hardships of earthly agriculture, no drought, no pests, no crop failures, just endless cycles of planting and harvesting, forever. For a civilization that depended utterly on agriculture, that had to work hard for every harvest, this vision of paradise makes perfect sense. The ideal afterlife was life as you knew it, but perfected. The field of reeds appears over and over in funerary texts. In the coffin texts, written on coffins during the Middle Kingdom around 2000 BCE, the descriptions become more detailed. The deceased person, if they successfully passed the judgment of their soul, would be ferried to this garden paradise. They would be given land to farm. The texts specify the size of these heavenly fields, sometimes described as 1,000 aruat, a measurement that equals about 700 acres. That's a massive garden, more than enough to support a person for eternity. But here's where it gets interesting from a practical perspective. The ancient Egyptians worried that they might not be able to do all that agricultural work themselves in the afterlife. Farming is hard labour. So they developed a solution. They would bring servants with them, not real people, but magical substitutes. These were the Shabti or Ushabti figures, small mummy-shaped figurines placed in tombs. The wealthy might have hundreds of these figures. Each was inscribed with a spell, chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, which begins with these words, written as the Shabti speaking, "O Shabti, if I am called, or if I am appointed to do any work which has to be done in the realm of the dead, to cultivate the fields, to irrigate the banks, to transport sand from east to west, then you shall say, 'Here I am, I shall do it.'" Archaeologists have found Shabtis by the thousands. King Tutankhamun had 413 of them in his tomb. Some are beautifully crafted from precious materials, others are simple clay. But all had the same purpose, to serve as magical agricultural labourers in the afterlife. Many hold tiny hoes or carry baskets on their backs. These details weren't decorative, they showed the Shabtis ready to work in the eternal garden. The tomb itself was often designed to invoke garden imagery. Tomb paintings frequently show gardens, depicting the deceased person sitting in their garden, enjoying its shade and beauty. These weren't memories of a specific earthly garden, though they might have been inspired by one. They were maps of what the deceased hoped to find or create in the afterlife. By painting the garden on the tomb wall, they were magically ensuring it would exist in the other world. Some of these painted gardens are extraordinarily detailed. The tomb of Nebamun, a nobleman from around 1350 BCE, whose painted walls are now in the British Museum, shows an elaborate garden scene. There's a rectangular pool filled with lotus flowers, fish and ducks. Around the pool are date palms, figs and sycamores, each tree carefully painted with botanical accuracy. Beneath the trees are rows of smaller plants. The whole scene is organized and orderly, showing the controlled cultivation that characterized Egyptian gardens. This wasn't wild nature, it was nature perfected by human care. Even more fascinating are the actual garden models placed in tombs. These are three-dimensional miniatures, giving us incredibly detailed information about garden layout. One of the finest examples is the model garden of Meket Rey, found in his tomb at Deir el-Bahri and dating to about 2000 BCE. The model shows a rectangular courtyard surrounded by a colonnade. In the centre is a pool with steps leading down into the water, probably for ritual bathing. Around the pool are miniature trees, each one carved and painted. The whole model is about 27 inches long, incredibly detailed. Looking at it, you can see exactly how an Egyptian garden was structured. It's like an architectural blueprint in 3 dimensions. Why go to such trouble? Because the ancient Egyptians believed in sympathetic magic. If you created an image or model of something, that thing could become real in the afterlife. The model garden in the tomb meant the deceased would have an actual garden in the afterlife. The painted scenes on the walls would become reality. The lists of offerings inscribed on tomb walls, including vegetables and fruits from gardens, would magically manifest as actual food for the deceased to eat forever. This belief had practical implications for the living. Families of the deceased were expected to maintain offerings at the tomb. This included fresh plants and flowers from gardens. Archaeologists have found the dried remains of flower bouquets in tombs left by mourning relatives. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were magical provisions, sending the essence of the plants through to the deceased in the afterlife. Some tombs had actual gardens planted around them. The tomb complex wasn't just the underground burial chamber. It included a chapel where offerings were made, and often an outdoor space. At Deir el-Medina, the workers' village, archaeologists found evidence of small garden plots adjacent to some tombs. These were tended by the family, growing flowers and plants that would be offered to the deceased. The act of gardening itself became an act of religious devotion, a way to care for your dead loved ones. The most ambitious tomb gardens were those created for royalty. Although these have long since vanished, we have descriptions and archaeological traces. The mortuary temple of Mentuhotep II at Deir el-Bahri, built around 2000 BCE, had gardens integrated into its design. Excavations in the 1922 found the planting pits, rows of holes cut into the bedrock where trees had been planted. The trees would have been watered, requiring a permanent staff to carry water up to the elevated temple complex. This was a massive ongoing effort, but it was considered essential. The dead king needed his garden, both as an offering and as a place where his spirit could rest. Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled around 1470 BCE, built an even more elaborate mortuary temple right next to Mentuhotep's. Excavations there found similar evidence of gardens, but Hatshepsut did something extraordinary. She sent expeditions to the land of Punt, somewhere on the East African coast, probably modern Somalia or Eritrea. These expeditions brought back frankincense trees, myrrh trees, and other exotic plants. Reliefs on her temple walls show the trees being loaded onto ships, their roots carefully wrapped for the long journey. When they arrived in Egypt, these trees were planted in Hatshepsut's temple gardens. She was creating a garden of foreign wonders, displaying the reach of Egyptian power and bringing sacred plants home to Egypt. The temple reliefs at Karnak also show her gardens. There's a whole room called the Botanical Garden, whose walls are carved with images of plants and animals that Thutmose III brought back from his military campaigns in Syria and Palestine. These aren't Egyptian species, they're careful depictions of foreign flora and fauna. Botanists have identified some of them: iris species from the Levant, anemones from Syria, pomegranate varieties from Anatolia. These carvings served as a permanent record, a stone garden catalogue showing the exotic species that grew in the temple gardens. This brings us to an important aspect of Egyptian garden culture: the collection of exotic species. The Egyptians were curious about foreign lands and foreign plants. When they travelled, either through trade or military campaigns, they brought back seeds, cuttings, and sometimes whole trees. The pharaohs maintained what we might call botanical gardens, collections of unusual plants from across the known world. These weren't just for decoration, they were statements of power and prestige. They showed that the pharaoh controlled not just Egypt but distant lands as well. They demonstrated wealth, since keeping foreign plants alive required significant resources. And they showed piety, since many exotic plants had religious significance. The spiritual significance of specific plants was deeply important. We've mentioned some of these already: the lotus for rebirth, the sycamore fig for the goddess Hathor, the date palm for fertility. But there were many others. The Persea tree, an ancient species that no longer grows in Egypt, was sacred to Ra, the sun god. The willow was associated with Osiris, god of the dead and of resurrection. The tamarisk was connected to rebirth. Planting these trees in a garden wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a religious act, inviting the god's presence into your space. Some plants were considered so holy that only priests could tend them, or they could only grow in temple precincts. The blue lotus was particularly sacred. Although it grew wild in the delta marshes, cultivated blue lotuses in temple pools were used in religious ceremonies. Priests would harvest them at dawn when they opened, and the flowers would be presented to the gods on altars. The scent was believed to be pleasing to the divine. After the ceremony, these flowers might be distributed to worshippers or used to make perfumed oils. Incense plants were another category of religiously important species. Frankincense and myrrh, those biblical plants, were imported to Egypt at great expense and, as Hatshepsut's expedition shows, sometimes grown locally. These resins were burned in temples during daily rituals. The smoke, rising toward the sky, was believed to carry prayers up to the gods. Having incense trees in a temple garden meant a ready supply for rituals, and it showed the temple's wealth and the gods' favour. The relationship between gardens and resurrection myths was explicit in Egyptian religion. The story of Osiris, one of the central myths, involves death and rebirth through vegetation. According to the myth, Osiris was killed by his brother Set, who cut his body into pieces and scattered them across Egypt. Osiris's wife, Isis, searched for the pieces and reassembled them. Osiris couldn't return to life among the living, but he was resurrected as the lord of the underworld. In some versions of the myth, plants grew from his body, grain sprouted from his remains. Osiris became synonymous with the agricultural cycle, dying with the harvest, reborn with the planting. This myth was reenacted annually in Egyptian temples through a ritual involving Osiris beds. These were moulds in the shape of Osiris's body, filled with soil and planted with grain. As the grain sprouted and grew, it showed Osiris's resurrection. The green shoots represented life returning. Archaeological excavations have found actual Osiris beds in tombs, placed there to ensure the deceased would be reborn like Osiris. Some still had dried grain stalks in them, the plants that sprouted over 2,000 years ago and were then sealed in the tomb forever. In the later periods of Egyptian history, after Alexander's conquest and during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, garden culture became even more elaborate. The city of Alexandria was famous for its gardens. The royal palaces had extensive pleasure gardens, described in ancient accounts as rivals to the hanging gardens of Babylon. The Museum of Alexandria, the great research institution, had botanical gardens where scholars studied plants from across the Mediterranean, Africa, and Asia. This was where Greek scientific thinking met Egyptian practical knowledge, creating a synthesis that would influence European botany 1,000 years later. But even in these cosmopolitan later periods, The old Egyptian ideas persisted. Gardens were still sacred spaces. They were still connected to the afterlife. They still embodied the Egyptian ideal of creating order and abundance from the chaos of the desert. The plants might have become more diverse, the designs might have incorporated foreign influences, but the core concept remained the same. A garden was a place where humans and gods could meet, where life was sustained and celebrated, and where the promise of eternal rebirth was made visible in every sprouting seed and opening flower. Chapter 4. Gardens in Daily Life and Social Structure. What did a typical day in an ancient Egyptian garden actually look like? Who did the work? And what exactly did that work involve? To really understand Egyptian gardens, we need to move beyond the big picture and into the practical, daily details of garden life. We need to see the garden through the eyes of the people who worked there, rested there, and depended on it. Let's start with dawn, because that's when garden work typically began. The ancient Egyptians didn't have alarm clocks, but they didn't need them. As soon as the first grey light appeared in the eastern sky, people were waking up. Houses in ancient Egypt were small and got uncomfortably warm even early in the morning. People naturally woke with the light and the rising heat. In a household with a garden, someone, often multiple people, would head outside to begin the day's garden tasks. The first job was water inspection. The gardener would walk the property, checking the soil moisture, looking at the plants. After a night's coolness, this was when you could see how each plant was doing. Were the leaves drooping, suggesting water stress? Were there signs of insect damage that appeared overnight? Was fruit ripening and ready to pick? This morning inspection was crucial for understanding what needed attention that day. If watering was needed, and it usually was, this was the best time to do it. The air was still cool, the sun wasn't yet fierce, and water wouldn't evaporate immediately. At a modest household, this meant working the shadoof, lifting water from the storage pool into the irrigation channels. This wasn't a quick job. Filling all the channels to adequately water the garden could take an hour or more of steady work, pulling and releasing the shadoof in a rhythmic pattern that was probably meditative in its repetition. Who did this work? That depended on the household's wealth and structure. In a modest household, the man of the house might do the heavy water lifting, while his wife and children would help with other tasks, like weeding, harvesting, and tending specific plants. But this wasn't strictly gendered work. Tomb paintings show both men and women working in gardens. One famous scene from the tomb of Ipui shows a woman kneeling and harvesting flax while a man operates the shadoof nearby. They're working together, a team keeping the garden alive. In wealthier households, servants did the heavy labour. Some large estates employed professional gardeners, people whose entire job was garden maintenance. We know this from administrative texts. The Wilbur Papyrus, that tax document we mentioned earlier, lists occupations and shows people identified specifically as gardeners, distinct from general field workers. These weren't slaves, exactly, though Egyptian society did have slavery. More often, they were free workers, employed permanently or seasonally, receiving payment in the form of food rations, beer, and sometimes clothing or other goods. The temples and palaces had whole staffs of garden workers. At Karnak, administrative texts show there were dozens of gardeners working permanently, supervised by overseers who reported to higher-level administrators. This was a hierarchy, like any large organization. The head gardener was a person of some importance, literate, capable of keeping records, understanding accounts. Below them were specialists, people who focused on specific tasks like tree pruning or flower cultivation. At the bottom were general labourers who did the basic work of weeding, watering, and hauling soil. After the morning watering, there was weeding. Gardens required constant vigilance against unwanted plants. In the rich, irrigated soil of an Egyptian garden, weeds grew as enthusiastically as crops. They had to be removed regularly, or they'd overwhelm everything else. This was tedious work, best done in the early morning before the heat became oppressive. Workers would move through the garden rows, pulling out anything that didn't belong, tossing the pulled weeds into baskets to be hauled away, probably to the compost area. Archaeological excavations at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village, found actual gardening tools preserved in the dry conditions. These tools are surprisingly familiar to any modern gardener. There were hoes, wooden handles with blades attached, used for breaking up soil and digging planting holes. There were sickles with flint or bronze blades, perfect for cutting grain or trimming plants. There were carrying poles with baskets suspended from each end, allowing workers to transport water, soil, or harvested produce efficiently. These tools are now in museums, the same implements that someone used 3,000 years ago to tend a garden, still showing the wear patterns from their hands. Pruning was a specialized skill. Date palms needed regular attention. Dead fronds had to be cut away, both for the tree's health and to prevent fire hazard in the dry climate. Fruit trees needed shaping to encourage production and keep them at a manageable height for harvesting. Grapevines required careful pruning to maximize fruit while keeping the vines healthy. This work required knowledge and experience. You couldn't just hack away randomly, or you'd damage the plant. Egyptian gardeners learned through practice, taught by experienced pruners, developing an eye for where to cut and when. We know they understood pruning because it appears in administrative texts. In the tomb autobiography of Ineni, an official who served under Thutmose I around 1500 BCE, he describes overseeing garden work, specifically mentioning the pruning of trees and vines. He understood this was skilled work worth noting. Some tomb paintings show workers in trees, trimming branches. The detail in these paintings suggests the artists were depicting real, familiar scenes, not imagined ones. As morning moved toward midday, outdoor work would slow and eventually stop. The heat was simply too much. Workers would retreat to shade, often the very shade their garden provided. The period from roughly noon to mid-afternoon was rest time. People would eat a meal, sleep, work on indoor tasks that required attention. The garden rested too, enduring the fierce sun, sustained by the morning's watering. But the garden wasn't abandoned entirely. Someone still needed to monitor it. If a valuable tree was showing signs of stress, additional water might be needed even in the heat of the day. If birds were attacking ripening fruit, they needed to be scared away. Children often had this job, sitting in the garden shade, watching, occasionally running to chase off a bird or call an adult if something seemed wrong. It was light work, suitable for younger kids, and it taught them to observe plants carefully, to recognize when something was amiss. Late afternoon brought renewed activity. As the sun lowered and temperatures dropped from unbearable to merely uncomfortable, people returned to the garden. This was harvesting time. Whatever was ripe needed to be picked. Tomatoes didn't exist in ancient Egypt, but lettuce, onions, cucumbers, and other vegetables did, and they needed regular harvesting. Fruit trees ripened in their seasons. Figs came on in summer, dates in fall, other fruits at their appointed times. When fruit was ready, it had to be harvested quickly, or it would spoil or be eaten by pests. Harvesting was often a family activity, everyone working together. Paintings from the tomb of Nakht at Thebes, dating to about 1400 BCE, show fruit harvesting in detail. Men are shown climbing trees or standing on ladders, picking fruit and filling baskets. Below, women and children receive the baskets, sort the fruit, and carry it away for storage. These scenes show harvesting as social time, people working together, probably talking and singing while they worked. It was hard work, but it was also communal, a shared effort to bring in the abundance the garden provided. Evening was probably the most pleasant time in an Egyptian garden. The heat was fading, the work was done, and the garden became a space for relaxation and socializing. Tomb paintings often show the deceased seated in their garden during evening time, the light golden, shadows long. Sometimes they're shown with family members, children playing nearby, a wife sitting beside them. Sometimes musicians are present, providing entertainment. Sometimes there are servants bringing food and drink. These scenes tell us that gardens were living spaces, outdoor rooms as important as any indoor space. Wealthier homes might have pavilions in the garden, semi-permanent structures with roofs for shade and benches, or low platforms where people could recline. These pavilions appear in both paintings and archaeological sites. At Amarna, excavators found the remains of several garden pavilions, the post holes showing where wooden columns had supported roofs, the floor areas showing slightly different soil composition from trampling and use. The garden pool served multiple purposes in these evening hours. It was certainly decorative, pleasant to look at and listen to, but it was also practical. The water evaporating from the pool's surface cooled the air around it. Sitting near the pool, you'd feel noticeably cooler than elsewhere. People probably dangled their feet in the water, cooling off after the day's heat. Children might have splashed and played, though this probably depended on how formal the garden was and how strict the parents were about proper behaviour. This was also when gardens became romantic spaces. Egyptian love poetry, several collections of which have survived on papyrus, frequently mentions gardens as settings for romantic encounters. Young people would meet in gardens, either their own family gardens or perhaps public gardens near temples. The privacy provided by walls and trees, the beauty of the flowers, the pleasant evening coolness, all made gardens ideal for courtship. One poem describes a girl saying her garden is a trap to catch her beloved, with her body as the bait. Another has a young man comparing his lover's voice to the cooing of doves in the garden. These weren't abstract metaphors, they reflected how people actually used gardens. Gardens also served as workshop spaces. Many craft activities happened outdoors when possible, taking advantage of natural light and avoiding filling the small indoor spaces with the mess and smell of various crafts. Weaving sometimes happened in gardens, the large looms set up in shaded areas. Carpentry might be done outside. Food preparation certainly was. Ovens were typically outdoors due to fire risk and heat, often placed in or near the garden. Bread baking, beer brewing, and food processing would happen in the garden courtyard. This brings us to the productive role of gardens in the household economy. We've talked about the food gardens produced, but let's be more specific about the economics. A modest garden of about 2,000 square feet, which seems to have been typical for middle-class homes based on excavations at Amarna and Deir el-Medina, could produce a significant portion of a family's vegetable needs. If well maintained, such a garden could provide daily greens, onions, and other vegetables year-round, plus seasonal fruit from a few trees. The value of this production was substantial. In a society where most people's wealth consisted of food and basic goods rather than money, the garden was essentially a food production factory attached to your house. The grain for bread came from agricultural fields, but the vegetables and fruit that made the meal more nutritious and varied came from the home garden. For a working family, this could mean the difference between a barely adequate diet and a healthy, varied one. Surplus production could be traded. If your garden produced more onions than your family could eat, you could trade them for something you needed. Personal commerce in ancient Egypt was largely barter. Small-scale trading happened constantly, between neighbours, in local markets. A basket of dates might be traded for a piece of cloth. Extra cucumbers might be exchanged for a clay pot or a measure of grain. Gardens fed into this economy, providing tradable goods. Some people specialized in garden production for trade. We have records of market gardeners, people who grew vegetables specifically to sell or trade. They didn't necessarily have larger gardens than anyone else. They just used their space more intensively, maximizing production. The Wilbur Papyrus mentions people who paid their taxes in vegetables rather than grain, suggesting they were specialists who grew vegetables as a primary economic activity. The social status associated with gardens is fascinating. Everyone had some garden space, even the poorest workers, but the size and elaboration of your garden announced your social position. A modest house had a small utilitarian garden focused on food production. A mid-level official's house had a larger garden with some decorative elements, maybe a small pool, a few flower beds among the vegetables. An elite villa had extensive gardens with large pools, many trees, elaborate plantings, perhaps multiple garden areas for different purposes. These differences were visible. Egyptian houses often had flat roofs where people spent time, especially in the evening. From your roof, you could see into neighbours' gardens, over their courtyard walls. The state of someone's garden was public information. A well-maintained garden signalled that the household was prosperous and well-managed. A neglected garden suggested the opposite. In a society that highly valued order and control over nature, letting your garden go to chaos was almost a moral failing. This created social pressure to maintain your garden well, even if you didn't personally care much about it. Your garden reflected on your family's reputation. We have literary texts that mention gardens as a measure of a person's worth. In the Instruction of Ani, a wisdom text from around 1000 BCE, a father advises his son on how to live properly. Among the advice about honouring your mother and choosing good friends, there's a section about maintaining your property, including keeping your garden in good order. It was part of being a responsible person. For women, gardens were particularly important spaces. Much of Egyptian public life was male-dominated. Religious ceremonies, government administration, military activity, these were largely male spheres, but the home and its immediate surroundings were often managed by women. The garden was part of that domestic domain. A woman might have considerable authority over the household garden, deciding what to plant, when to harvest, how to use the produce. This was real economic power. Control over a productive resource that fed the family and generated tradable surplus. Some women gained recognition specifically for their garden management skills. In the autobiography of Warkar from the Middle Kingdom period, around 2000 BCE, he specifically praises his mother for her management of the household, including the garden. He credits her wisdom in planting and harvesting with contributing to the family's prosperity. This wasn't common. Most tomb autobiographies focused on the deceased person's own accomplishments, but the fact that it appears at all shows that garden management was recognized as a valuable skill. Children grew up in gardens, and this shaped their understanding of the world. From earliest childhood, Egyptian children would have been surrounded by growing things, by the cycle of planting and harvest, by the work required to make things grow. This wasn't abstract knowledge learned from books. It was concrete, learned through participation. Even small children could help with simple tasks, collecting ripe fruit, pulling weeds, scattering seeds. As they grew, their responsibilities increased. By adolescence, they would have substantial knowledge of plant care, seasonal timing, and garden maintenance. This childhood experience in gardens probably shaped Egyptian religion and worldview. When you grow up watching seeds sprout, plants grow, and fruit ripen, the ideas of death and rebirth don't seem abstract. They're daily realities. You see that plants die and return. You see that decay creates new life, that composted material feeds new growth. The religious concepts of death as a transition and the possibility of resurrection weren't philosophical abstractions for ancient Egyptians. They were patterns you could see in your garden every day. The theology grew from the agriculture as much as the agriculture was shaped by theology. Gardens also served as outdoor living rooms for social events. When families had guests, they often entertained in the garden, especially in pleasant weather, which was most of the year. Tomb paintings show banquet scenes set in gardens, guests seated on chairs or cushions under trees, servants bringing food and drink, musicians playing. These weren't just artistic conventions. They showed real practices. The garden was where you showed hospitality, where you demonstrated your prosperity and taste. The condition and arrangement of your garden when entertaining said something about you. Fresh flowers would be displayed, the garden would be swept clean, the pool would be clear. If you had exotic plants, foreign species, rare varieties, you would draw attention to them. Look at this Persea tree, brought all the way from Nubia. It was a form of social display, like having nice furniture or fine serving vessels. Your garden was part of your social identity. In this way, gardens were deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life and social relationships. They weren't separate from life. They were life. They were workspace and rest space, food source and beauty, private retreat and social stage. They connected the household to the rhythms of nature, to the seasons, to the fundamental activities of cultivation and harvest that sustained civilization. Understanding this integration helps us understand how central gardens were to Egyptian culture, not as luxury or decoration, but as essential components of human life. Chapter 5: The Healing Garden and Medicinal Plants. What did ancient Egyptians do when they got sick, and what did their gardens have to do with it? The answer reveals a sophisticated understanding of plants' medicinal properties that combined practical observation with spiritual belief, creating a medical system that persisted for thousands of years and influenced medical traditions far beyond Egypt's borders. Ancient Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced for its time. We know this because the Egyptians wrote it down, and some of those writings survived. The medical papyri are some of the oldest medical texts in existence. The Immerse papyrus, which we mentioned earlier, is over 110 pages long and contains more than 700 remedies and magical formulas. The Edwin Smith papyrus, another major medical text, contains 48 cases of injuries and diseases, describing symptoms and treatments with a clinical precision that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern medical journal. These texts show us that Egyptian doctors were careful observers who documented what worked and what didn't. Many of the remedies in these texts involved plants, and many of those plants could be grown in gardens. The garden, in other words, was also a pharmacy. Let's look at specific examples of medicinal plants that grew in Egyptian gardens and how they were used. Garlic, which we've already mentioned as a food plant, was equally important as medicine. The Immerse papyrus prescribes garlic for heart problems, specifically recommending it to strengthen the heart and improve circulation. Modern science has confirmed that garlic does indeed have cardiovascular benefits, including reducing blood pressure and cholesterol. The Egyptians didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew from observation that people who ate garlic seemed to have fewer heart troubles. The papyrus also recommends garlic for intestinal parasites, another use that modern medicine confirms is effective. Onions appear in medical texts almost as frequently as garlic. They were prescribed for respiratory problems, infections, and digestive issues. One remedy from the Immerse papyrus involves crushing onions, mixing them with beer, and drinking the mixture to treat coughs and chest congestion. That might sound unpleasant, and it probably was, but onions do contain compounds with antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. This remedy might actually have helped. Coriander, both the seeds and the fresh leaves, was a medicinal plant. The Egyptians grew coriander in gardens and used it to treat digestive complaints, headaches, and joint pain. Archaeological excavations have found coriander seeds in multiple contexts, both in domestic sites and in tombs, where they were included among funeral provisions. The Immerse papyrus describes several preparations using coriander, some taken internally, others applied as poultices to painful areas. Fenugreek was another plant grown for both food and medicine. The seeds could be ground and made into a paste, which was applied to reduce inflammation and swelling. Fenugreek appears in remedies for skin conditions and for promoting milk production in nursing mothers, a use that persists in traditional medicine today. The plant was easy to grow, tolerating the heat and requiring minimal care, making it an ideal addition to the medicinal garden. Juniper berries were valued for urinary and kidney problems. The juniper didn't grow naturally in Egypt's lowland regions. It was a plant of higher elevations. But the Egyptians imported juniper and, in some cases, managed to cultivate it in gardens by providing extra water and care. The berries appear in multiple medical remedies, crushed and mixed with other ingredients to treat bladder infections and kidney stones. Modern research confirms that juniper does have diuretic properties and can help with urinary tract health. Cumin was both a cooking spice and a medicine. The Ebers Papyrus recommends cumin for digestive problems, specifically for relieving gas and bloating. It was also used in fumigations, burned to produce aromatic smoke believed to have purifying properties. Cumin grew easily in Egyptian gardens, and its double use meant it was almost universally cultivated. Mint, several species of it, grew in Egyptian gardens. The Egyptians used mint to treat stomach problems, bad breath, and respiratory congestion. Mint tea isn't mentioned explicitly in the surviving medical papyri, but given that Egyptians made infusions of many plants by steeping them in hot water, they almost certainly made mint tea. The plant was easy to grow. It liked water and shade, making it perfect for growing near garden pools under the cover of larger plants. Lettuce, surprisingly, had medicinal uses beyond being a food. The ancient Egyptians believed lettuce had sedative properties. This is because of the white sap that comes out when you cut the stem. In larger quantities, this sap can indeed have mild sedative effects. Egyptian medical texts recommend lettuce preparations for sleep problems and to reduce pain. Whether these preparations were effective is debatable, but the belief was strong enough that lettuce became associated with sleep and rest. The opium poppy was grown in some Egyptian gardens, though it was never as central to Egyptian medicine as it was in some other ancient cultures. The poppy appears in medical texts as a pain reliever and sleep aid, which makes sense given that opium is a powerful narcotic. Its use seems to have been relatively limited and controlled, probably because the Egyptians recognized it could be dangerous. Poppy seeds have been found in archaeological contexts, including in the tomb of Tutankhamun, indicating the plant was known and used, even if not widely. Castor oil plant was common in gardens, grown for its oil. The Egyptians extracted oil from castor beans and used it for multiple purposes. Medically, it was a powerful laxative used to treat constipation and cleanse the digestive system. The Ebers Papyrus describes its preparation and dosage carefully, indicating doctors knew it had to be used correctly to be safe. Castor oil was also used in cosmetics and as lamp oil, making the plant valuable for multiple reasons. Aloe, specifically the variety native to Africa, grew in some gardens. The Egyptians used aloe gel to treat burns, wounds, and skin conditions. The Ebers Papyrus describes applying aloe to burns and infections. This is one of those cases where ancient practice aligns perfectly with modern understanding. We know now that aloe has compounds that promote healing and reduce inflammation. Egyptian doctors didn't know the biochemistry, but they knew from experience that putting aloe on a burn made it heal faster. Frankincense and myrrh, those exotic imports that some wealthy gardens cultivated, had medicinal uses beyond their religious roles. Frankincense was used to treat arthritis and inflammation. Modern research has confirmed that frankincense resin contains compounds with anti-inflammatory properties. Myrrh was used for its antibacterial effects, applied to wounds and infections. It was also used in dental care, which makes sense given that myrrh does have antibacterial effects that could help with gum disease. The date palm, that universal tree of Egyptian gardens, provided medicine as well as food. Different parts of the tree had different uses. The dates themselves were believed to be strengthening, good for building stamina and energy. Date palm pollen was used in fertility treatments, recommended for women trying to conceive. Whether this had any actual effect is unknown, but the association between date palms and fertility was strong in Egyptian culture. Palm sap was used to treat digestive problems and as a general tonic. The willow tree, sacred to Osiris, was also medicinally important. Willow bark contains salicin, a compound that the human body converts into salicylic acid, which is essentially aspirin. The Egyptians didn't know about salicin, but they knew that preparations made from willow bark reduced pain and fever. Multiple remedies in the Ebers. Papyrus call for willow. It was used to treat headaches, joint pain, fever, and inflammation. Egyptian doctors had discovered, through trial and error, one of the most important pain relievers in human history. The preparation of these plant medicines was a skilled process. It wasn't as simple as picking a plant and eating it. Remedies required specific preparations. Plants might need to be dried first, then ground into powder. They might be mixed with specific liquids, water, beer, wine, or milk. They might be combined with other ingredients to enhance their effect or reduce side effects. They might be applied as poultices, drunk as infusions, used in fumigations, or made into suppositories. The medical papyri give detailed instructions for these preparations, showing that this was precise work requiring training and expertise. Who had this expertise? Egyptian society had professional physicians, doctors who specialized in diagnosis and treatment. Some were generalists, treating all manner of ailments. Others specialized in specific areas. There were eye specialists, dentists, and doctors who focused on internal medicine. These physicians were literate, trained through apprenticeship with established doctors, and often worked in temples or attached to palaces and wealthy households. They had access to medical texts, which they studied and copied, preserving and transmitting medical knowledge across generations. But there were also less formal healers. In villages and among working-class people who couldn't afford professional physicians, there were people with reputations for healing knowledge, often older women who knew which plants helped which conditions and how to prepare them. This knowledge was transmitted orally, passed down through families. These healers had their own gardens where they cultivated medicinal plants, and they would gather wild plants as well from areas along the river or in the desert edges. The boundary between medicine and magic was fluid in ancient Egyptian healing. Many remedies in the medical papyri are accompanied by incantations, words to be spoken while preparing or administering the medicine. From a modern perspective, we might dismiss these as superstition, but they served important psychological functions. The incantations invoked gods and protective powers, reassuring the patient that powerful forces were being marshaled for their healing. This psychological reassurance might have had real effects, what we'd now call a placebo effect, making patients feel better and possibly improving outcomes. Some plants were used primarily for their magical protective qualities, rather than any direct medicinal effect. Garlic wasn't just eaten for health, it was hung in doorways to ward off evil spirits and disease. Onions were placed in houses and tombs for protection. Coriander seeds were worn as amulets. These practices show how intertwined medicine, magic, and religion were in Egyptian thought. Healing wasn't just about fixing the body, it was about addressing the spiritual causes of illness and protecting against supernatural threats. The concept of disease itself was different in ancient Egyptian thinking than in modern medicine. The Egyptians didn't have germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They understood disease as an imbalance in the body, or as something sent by the gods or evil spirits. Different diseases were associated with different deities. The goddess Sekhmet, for example, was believed to send plagues and epidemics, but she could also heal them if properly propitiated. Treatment, therefore, involved both physical remedies and religious rituals. Gardens fit into this worldview perfectly. A garden was a space of life and growth, the opposite of the sterile desert where nothing grew. Having a flourishing garden was itself a protective act, surrounding your home with life and abundance. The specific plants in the garden, especially those with medicinal and protective properties, added layers of defense against disease and misfortune. Maintaining your garden well was a way of maintaining your health and your family's well-being. Some evidence suggests that healing gardens specifically designed for growing medicinal plants, existed at major temples. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, a Ptolemaic period temple whose walls are covered with texts and images, has reliefs showing what appears to be a medicinal garden layout. The walls list plants and their properties. While this temple was built relatively late, in the last few centuries BCE, it was recording knowledge that went back much further into Egyptian history. The Greeks who came to Egypt after Alexander's conquest were amazed by Egyptian medical knowledge and sought to learn from it. The Library of Alexandria, during the Ptolemaic period, became a center of medical study, and much of that study focused on Egyptian medicinal plants. Greek physicians working in Egypt documented Egyptian remedies, translating them into Greek and incorporating them into the broader Mediterranean medical tradition. This is how some Egyptian plant knowledge survived, passed through Greek and later Roman and Islamic physicians, eventually influencing European medicine. Some remedies that appear in medieval European herbals can be traced back through this chain to ancient Egyptian sources. The Islamic period in Egypt saw a continuation of the garden medicine tradition. Arab physicians working in Egypt maintained gardens of medicinal plants, studying and writing about them extensively. The works of physicians like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who wrote in the 11th century CE, show clear influence from earlier Egyptian sources. He documented hundreds of medicinal plants, many of which grew in Egyptian gardens, describing their properties and uses in ways that echo the ancient papyri. Modern scientific research has vindicated many ancient Egyptian medical uses of plants. Studies have confirmed that garlic does support cardiovascular health. Willow bark does reduce pain and inflammation. Aloe does promote healing of burns and skin damage. Juniper does have urinary health benefits. The Egyptians didn't have the scientific framework to understand why these plants worked, but through careful observation over thousands of years, they identified effects that modern biochemistry can now explain. This raises interesting questions about knowledge and how it develops. Ancient Egyptian physicians were conducting what we'd now call empirical research. They tried different treatments, observed the results, and kept records of what worked. The medical papyri represent the accumulation of this knowledge over centuries or even millennia. They're databases of treatments, organized by condition, with the most effective remedies presumably rising to prominence through repeated successful use. This is essentially the scientific method, even though it was embedded in a worldview very different from modern science. The gardener's pharmacy meant that basic healthcare was accessible to most people. You didn't need to buy expensive imported medicines. You could grow your own remedies right outside your door. The knowledge of which plants helped which conditions was widespread, part of common culture. This democratized healthcare to a degree that wouldn't be seen again until much later in history. Yes, wealthy people had access to professional physicians and rare imported ingredients, but everyone could grow garlic and onions and mint, and everyone knew these plants had healing properties. There's something deeply satisfying about the idea of the medicinal garden, of having healing resources growing right where you live. It represents a kind of self-sufficiency and connection to nature that modern life often lacks. The ancient Egyptians, living in a harsh environment, surrounded by desert, created these pockets of life and healing. Their gardens fed them, beautified their surroundings, connected them to the divine, and provided remedies when they were sick. It was an integrated system where practical needs and spiritual meaning reinforced each other, all growing from the same soil. Chapter 6: Garden Techniques and Ancient Botanical Knowledge. How did ancient Egyptians know so much about plants without science as we understand it today? This question takes us into the realm of botanical knowledge, plant breeding, and agricultural innovation that existed thousands of years before the development of modern botany. The ancient Egyptians were practical scientists, experimenting, observing, and passing down knowledge that let them shape the plant world to serve their needs. Let's start with seed selection, one of the most fundamental agricultural techniques. The Egyptians understood that plants grown from seeds would have characteristics similar to their parent plants. If you saved seeds from your best plants, the ones that grew tallest or produced the sweetest fruit or resisted pests better, then planted those seeds the next year, your crops would gradually improve. This is the basis of selective breeding, and the Egyptians practiced it systematically. We can see the results of this selection in archaeological plant remains. Botanists comparing ancient Egyptian grain samples with wild varieties of the same species find consistent differences. The ancient cultivated varieties have larger seeds, thinner seed coats, and other traits that make them better for human use, but would be disadvantages in the wild. These traits don't develop naturally. They're the result of humans deliberately selecting for them over many generations. The Egyptians were actively shaping their crops, creating better varieties through careful selection. This knowledge extended to garden plants. The best cucumbers would have their seeds saved for the next planting. The sweetest figs would be propagated. Over time, this created varieties specifically adapted to Egyptian conditions and Egyptian tastes. Some of these ancient varieties still exist, preserved in isolated areas or rediscovered through genetic analysis of modern crops. Scientists studying date palms, for example, have found genetic lineages that trace back thousands of years to varieties the ancient Egyptians cultivated. Propagation techniques went beyond seeds. The Egyptians understood vegetative propagation, the art of growing new plants from cuttings, divisions, or other parts of existing plants. This is crucial for many crops, because plants grown from cuttings are genetically identical to the parent, maintaining exact characteristics, while plants from seeds can be variable. For crops where consistency was important, like certain fruit trees or ornamental plants, cuttings were the way to go. We know the Egyptians used cuttings because tomb paintings show it. There are scenes of workers carrying small trees with their roots wrapped, preparing to transplant them. These aren't seedlings, they're rooted cuttings or divisions. The care shown in the paintings, with the roots carefully protected, indicates understanding that the root system needed to be kept intact and moist for successful transplanting. This is exactly what modern gardeners do when transplanting, showing the same fundamental understanding of plant needs. Grafting, the technique of joining parts of two different plants so they grow as one, might have been understood in later periods. Grafting is more sophisticated than cuttings. It requires precise cutting and binding so that the vascular tissues of two plants connect and grow together. There's some debate about whether ancient Egyptians practiced grafting. No texts explicitly describe it, and no paintings clearly show it. However, some botanical evidence suggests they might have. Certain fruit varieties found in ancient Egypt seem to require grafting to propagate, suggesting the technique was known, even if not widely documented. Understanding plant sexuality was another area of sophisticated knowledge. Many plants have separate male and female flowers, and fruit production requires pollination, the transfer of pollen from male to female. The Egyptians definitely understood this for date palms, which have male and female trees. Dates only grow on female trees, but those trees must be pollinated by pollen from male trees. If you planted only female trees or only male trees, you'd get no fruit. The Egyptians solved this through hand pollination. They would cut male flower clusters and shake them over female flowers, ensuring pollination. Multiple texts mention this practice, and paintings show it being done. The ancient Assyrians, neighbours of Egypt, explicitly described date palm pollination in their texts, and there's no reason to think the Egyptians, who had been growing dates for even longer, didn't understand it equally well. This is remarkable knowledge, requiring careful observation to understand the relationship between these trees and the pollination process. Seasonal timing was understood with precision. The Egyptians knew when to plant each crop, when it would grow, when it would be ready to harvest. This knowledge was encoded in agricultural calendars, charts that matched agricultural activities to the Egyptian calendar months. Some tomb texts include these calendars, showing what should be planted and harvested in each month. This wasn't superstition or arbitrary tradition. It was accumulated knowledge of how each plant responded to Egyptian seasonal conditions. The concept of microclimates, though they wouldn't have used that term, was clearly understood. Gardeners knew that different areas of a garden had different conditions. The north side of a wall would be shadier and cooler. The south side would get more sun and heat. Areas near the pool would be moister. Dry areas away from irrigation would be better for drought-tolerant plants. They used this knowledge to place plants where they'd thrive. Heat-loving plants went in full sun. Shade lovers went under trees or on the north side of structures. Moisture-loving plants went near water features. This knowledge appears in garden layouts excavated by archaeologists. The arrangement of plants wasn't random. Analysis of where different species were planted shows patterns that make sense from a horticultural perspective. Similar plants with similar needs were grouped together. Incompatible plants that might compete or harm each other were separated. This kind of thoughtful planning indicates deep understanding of plant ecology. Soil improvement, as we've discussed, was practiced regularly, but the Egyptians also understood that different plants preferred different soils. Some liked the heavy clay that was common in some areas. Others preferred sandier, better draining soil. Gardeners would sometimes bring in different soil types for specific plants, creating custom growing conditions. Archaeologists have found evidence of this. Areas in gardens where the soil composition is distinctly different from surrounding areas, indicating it was brought in specifically for certain plants. Water management was perhaps the area of greatest sophistication. The Egyptians understood that different plants needed different amounts of water. Vegetables generally needed consistent moisture. Fruit trees needed deep watering but could tolerate some drying between waterings. Some plants would rot if kept too wet. This understanding shaped irrigation practices. The system of channels and dams allowed precise control of water distribution, letting gardeners give each plant area the amount of water it needed. They also understood water quality. Not all water was the same. Fresh Nile water, drawn during or just after the flood, was considered the best. It was rich with silt and nutrients. Water that had sat in storage pools for a long time was less ideal, depleted of nutrients and possibly stagnant. Gardeners preferred to use the freshest water possible, especially for valuable plants. This is why constant water lifting from the river was necessary, not just to provide water quantity but to ensure water quality. The Egyptians were also aware of the relationship between plants and health, beyond the medicinal uses we've already discussed. They understood that certain plants growing together were healthier than others in isolation. We'd now call this companion planting. While they didn't understand the biochemical mechanisms, things like how some plants repel insects that attack other plants, they could observe the effects. A garden with diverse plants had fewer pest problems than a monoculture. Plants that grew near aromatic herbs often had less insect damage. These observations led to planting patterns that created healthier gardens. Pest management knowledge was extensive. Beyond the physical barriers and predators we've mentioned, the Egyptians used plant-based pest controls. Strong-smelling plants were used to repel insects. There's evidence that certain aromatic herbs were planted near vulnerable crops, or that crushed leaves were scattered on plants to deter pests. While no ancient text gives a detailed pest control manual, the scattered references in various documents and the evidence from archaeology suggest a sophisticated toolkit of techniques. Plant identification was a skill that extended beyond commonly cultivated species. The Egyptians knew wild plants as well, both those that grew along the Nile in natural areas and those found in the desert. Some of these wild plants were harvested for food, medicine, or other uses. Others were avoided as poisonous. This knowledge was essential for survival, and it shows in Egyptian art and texts. Plants are depicted with enough botanical detail that modern botanists can often identify them to species, indicating the artists knew these plants well and could distinguish between similar species. The Egyptians also had an understanding of plant succession and ecology. They knew that if an area was left alone, plants would colonize it in a predictable pattern. First, fast-growing weedy species. Then, if water was available, larger plants and eventually trees. They observed this in abandoned fields and could presumably predict what would happen in neglected gardens. This understanding informed their management practices. Regular maintenance prevented unwanted succession, keeping the garden in the desired state rather than letting it revert to wild vegetation. Some Egyptian botanical knowledge came from international connections. Egypt traded widely, and traders brought back knowledge as well as goods. Plants from Nubia to the south, from the Levant and Mesopotamia to the northeast, from Libya to the west, these all made their way into Egypt. Some were cultivated, others were simply known. Egyptian botanists, if we can call them that, had awareness of plant diversity extending far beyond Egypt's borders. The botanical reliefs at Karnak show species from Syria and Palestine accurately depicted. This indicates either that Egyptian artists travelled and saw these plants, or that live specimens or detailed descriptions were brought back to Egypt. During the New Kingdom period, particularly under expansionist pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II, when Egypt controlled a large empire, this botanical knowledge exchange intensified. Military campaigns weren't just about conquest. They were also information-gathering expeditions. The reliefs showing foreign plants weren't idle decoration. They were records, documenting what had been discovered. Some of these plants were brought back and cultivated in temple and palace gardens, living collections that allowed continued study. The later period, after Alexander's conquest in 332 BCE, brought Greek scientific thinking into contact with Egyptian practical knowledge. The result was an explosion of botanical study. The Museum of Alexandria included scholars studying plants systematically, creating what might be considered the first true botanical garden in the scientific sense, a collection designed for research and education rather than just display or production. These scholars had access to Egyptian records going back thousands of years, even if they couldn't read the hieroglyphic texts directly. Egyptian priests who could read the old scripts worked with Greek scholars, translating knowledge about plants and their uses. One product of this synthesis was the Herbal of Dioscorides, written by a Greek physician working in the 1st century CE. This text describes about 600 medicinal plants, many from Egypt, giving details of their appearance, properties, and uses. While Dioscorides was Greek and wrote in Greek, much of his information about Egyptian plants clearly came from earlier Egyptian sources, channeled through the Alexandria scholarly community. His Herbal was one of the most influential medical texts in history, used continuously from Roman times through the medieval period and into the Renaissance. Egyptian plant knowledge, filtered through Greek science, became foundational to European medicine. The Islamic period continued this tradition. Arab scholars in Egypt studied and preserved ancient knowledge. The Fatimid caliphs, who ruled Egypt from the 10th to 12th centuries CE, maintained elaborate gardens in Cairo and commissioned scholars to write about plants. These Arabic botanical texts sometimes quote earlier sources, preserving information that would otherwise be lost. Through Arabic science, ancient Egyptian knowledge about plants reached medieval Europe, influencing the development of European botany. What's remarkable is the continuity of this knowledge over such vast time spans. Techniques developed in the 3rd millennium BCE were still being used in the 2nd millennium CE, 4,000 years later. This wasn't stagnation or lack of innovation. It was a testament to how well these techniques worked. The Egyptians had figured out effective ways to grow plants in their environment, and those ways remained effective. Later additions and refinements built on this foundation rather than replacing it. Modern archaeobotany and plant genetics are revealing even more about ancient Egyptian botanical knowledge. DNA analysis of ancient plant remains is showing us the history of crop domestication and improvement with unprecedented detail. We can now trace how specific traits were selected for and how different varieties were related. We're discovering that ancient plant breeding was more sophisticated than we previously thought, that the Egyptians were manipulating plant genetics through selective breeding with remarkable precision, achieving results it took modern science decades of research to replicate deliberately. This ancient knowledge isn't just historical curiosity. Some of it is being rediscovered and applied today. As modern agriculture faces challenges like climate change, water scarcity, and the need for sustainable practices, researchers are looking at ancient techniques with new respect. The Egyptian methods of water-efficient irrigation, of maintaining soil fertility through composting, of managing pests without synthetic chemicals, these are relevant to current concerns. The ancient Egyptian garden, with its closed-loop systems and its integration of diverse plants in a small space, looks remarkably like what sustainable agriculture advocates propose for the future. Chapter 7. Sacred Plants and Religious Symbolism in Gardens. Why did ancient Egyptians consider certain plants sacred, and how did this spiritual dimension shape their gardens? To understand Egyptian gardens fully, we need to explore the deep religious meanings that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life, including the plants they chose to grow and how they arranged them. Gardens weren't just practical or beautiful spaces. They were sacred landscapes, places where the divine and human worlds intersected. Let's begin with the lotus, perhaps the most symbolically important plant in ancient Egypt. The blue lotus, which is actually a water lily, appears everywhere in Egyptian art, from temple columns shaped like lotus stems to paintings showing gods and humans holding lotus flowers. The white lotus was equally important, but why did the lotus hold such significance? The answer lies in the plant's behavior and how the Egyptians interpreted it. Lotus flowers close at night and sink below the water surface. In the morning, they rise and open again with the sunrise. To the Egyptians, this daily cycle of closing and opening, of descending into darkness and rising into light, symbolized death and rebirth. It was a living metaphor for their central religious concern, the possibility of resurrection after death. In creation myths, the lotus played a fundamental role. One version of the Egyptian creation story said that the first land that emerged from the primordial waters was a mound, and from this mound grew a giant lotus. When the lotus opened, the sun god Ra emerged from its center, bringing light into the world. Every lotus that opened in an Egyptian garden pool was a miniature reenactment of creation, a reminder of how life and light emerged from chaos and darkness. Having lotuses in your garden pool was therefore profoundly meaningful. You weren't just growing pretty flowers, you were creating a sacred space, a small version of the primordial creation. Sitting beside your garden pool in the evening, watching lotuses close as darkness came, then seeing them open again at dawn, you were witnessing cosmic patterns, participating in the daily renewal of creation. This gave ordinary domestic life a spiritual dimension that's hard for us to fully grasp today. The papyrus plant carried similar symbolic weight. Papyrus thickets represented the concept of primordial swamps, the watery chaos from which creation emerged. But papyrus was also specifically associated with Lower Egypt, the Delta region. In Egyptian cosmology, Egypt was divided into two lands. Upper Egypt, the narrow Nile Valley, was represented by the lotus. Lower Egypt, the broad delta, was represented by papyrus. The unification of these two lands into a single kingdom was a foundational concept of Egyptian identity. Garden pools often contained both lotus and papyrus growing together. This wasn't just aesthetic variety, it was symbolic representation of the two lands unified, a miniature version of all Egypt. When a pharaoh built a palace garden with lotus and papyrus together, he was making a political statement about his rule over unified Egypt. When an ordinary person planted both in their small garden pool, they were participating in this same symbolism, connecting their modest household to the grand concepts of Egyptian nationhood. Trees carried their own sacred associations. The sycamore fig, as we've mentioned, was connected to the goddess Hathor, but the relationship was more specific than just a general association. In Egyptian belief, certain sycamore fig trees were thought to stand at the boundary between the world of the living and the afterlife. The soul of the deceased would encounter these trees on their journey. The goddess Hathor, or sometimes the goddess Nut, would emerge from the tree and offer the soul food and water, sustaining them for the remainder of their journey. This belief meant that having a sycamore fig in your garden took on special significance. This wasn't just a shade tree or a source of fruit. It was a connection to the afterlife, a reminder of the journey that awaited. Some people planted sycamore figs specifically as monuments to deceased family members, creating a living memorial that also served as a symbolic gateway to the other world. Sitting under a sycamore fig, you might remember the dead, praying for their well-being in the afterlife, confident that the goddess was caring for them, just as this tree provided care for you through its shade and fruit. The Persea tree, an evergreen species that was native to East Africa and cultivated in Egypt, was sacred to Ra, the sun god. The Persea was believed to be a tree of life, and in some texts, the names of pharaohs were written on the leaves of a divine Persea tree, ensuring their eternal life. Having a Persea tree in your garden connected you to solar theology and to the royal cult. It was a prestigious plant, not easy to grow in Egypt's climate, requiring careful attention. Successfully maintaining a Persea tree demonstrated both horticultural skill and proper religious devotion. The date palm, beyond its practical value, had religious significance related to the passage of time and the measurement of years. The annual cycle of date production, with its predictable timing, made the date palm a living calendar. The palm was associated with both Ra and with the concept of millions of years of eternal time. In hieroglyphic writing, the sign for year was a palm branch. Having date palms in your garden literally meant you were surrounded by representations of time and eternity. Willow trees, as we've mentioned, were sacred to Osiris. The connection came from Osiris's death and resurrection myth. In some versions of the story, after Set killed Osiris and scattered his body parts, one piece came to rest in a place where a willow tree grew. The tree enclosed the body part within itself, protecting it until Isis could retrieve it. Thus the willow became associated with death, mourning, and the hope of resurrection. Willows were often planted in cemetery areas and near tombs. They were also grown in gardens, where they served as reminders of the Osiris myth and as sources of medicinal bark for pain relief. Certain flowers beyond the lotus had religious significance. The cornflower was associated with purity and was used in religious ceremonies and funeral rites. The poppy was connected to the god Nefertem, a deity associated with perfumes and fragrance, often shown with a lotus flower on his head but also connected to other beautiful plants. The mandrake, with its supposedly magical properties, was linked to love goddesses like Hathor. Even vegetables could have religious associations. The onion, so common and practical, was also sacred. Its concentric layers were seen as symbolizing eternity, circles within circles going on forever. Onions were given as offerings in temples and placed in tombs. The multiple layers were also connected to rebirth. Just as you could peel away layer after layer of an onion, so the deceased would shed their earthly form layer by layer until their spiritual essence emerged, ready for rebirth. The vine and grape cultivation had associations with wine, which played a role in religious ceremonies. Wine was offered to gods in temples during daily rituals. It was also consumed during religious festivals. The god Osiris was sometimes credited with teaching humanity how to make wine. Having grape vines in your garden connected you to this divine gift. The annual cycle of vine growth, fruiting, harvest, and winter dormancy also echoed themes of death and rebirth central to Egyptian religion. Garden layout itself could have religious symbolism. The rectangular shape, common in Egyptian gardens, wasn't just practical. Rectangles and straight lines represented order imposed on chaos, human control over wild nature. This was a central concept in Egyptian thought. The goddess Ma'at embodied truth, order, and justice. Creating and maintaining an orderly garden was a way of serving Ma'at, of doing your part to keep chaos at bay. A neglected, overgrown garden represented the opposite, the Isfet or chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm human order. The four corners of a garden could represent the four cardinal directions or the four corners of the earth. Garden layouts sometimes emphasized this fourfold division, with paths or channels running from a central point toward the four edges. This pattern echoed temple layouts and cosmological diagrams. Your garden became a miniature cosmos, a map of the universe as the Egyptians understood it, with you at the center, managing and maintaining it. Water in the garden carried profound symbolism. Water was the primordial substance from which creation emerged. The annual Nile flood was the return of these creative waters, bringing life and fertility. A garden pool was a contained version of these cosmic waters. The water held life, both the fish and plants that lived in it, and the potential life it represented through its use in irrigation. Water was also a purifying substance used in religious rituals. Having clean, clear water in your garden pool meant you had a source of physical and spiritual purification right at home. The gods were believed to be present in gardens, not metaphorically but literally. Gardens were places where you might encounter the divine. This is why temple gardens were so important and so carefully maintained. These were spaces where worshippers could walk and where gods were believed to manifest. But even home gardens had this quality. Hathor might be present in your sycamore fig. Ra might be honoured through your Persea tree. Osiris was connected to every plant that died and grew back. The garden was a space where sacred and everyday life were completely intertwined. This religious dimension influenced garden behaviour and etiquette. You approached your garden with respect. Before harvesting fruit from a sacred tree, you might say a prayer or offer thanks to the associated deity. When planting seeds, you might invoke the god's blessing for successful growth. The work of gardening wasn't just agricultural labour. It was a form of worship, a way of participating in the divine order of creation. Festivals and holidays often involved garden plants. During religious celebrations, homes would be decorated with flowers and branches. Priests would carry plants in processions. Specific plants were associated with specific festivals. The Festival of Hathor, for example, involved extensive use of flowers and the distribution of floral bouquets. During the Festival of Min, the fertility god, lettuce was prominently featured in offerings and rituals. Having a garden meant you could participate fully in these festivals, providing your own plants for celebration and devotion. Some plants were used to make sacred oils and perfumes. Temple gardens grew plants specifically for this purpose. Moringa trees provided oil. Lotus flowers were crushed to extract their fragrance. Various herbs and flowers were macerated in oils to create perfumed ointments. These weren't just cosmetics, though they were certainly used for personal adornment. They were sacred substances used in religious rituals, in anointing statues of gods, and in preparing the dead for burial. The entire perfume-making process, from growing the plants to extracting and preparing the oils, was a religious act. The Book of the Dead, that collection of spells meant to guide the deceased through the afterlife, contains passages involving plants. Spell 110, which describes the field of reeds where the blessed dead would live, gives details about the plants growing there. Spell 125, the famous judgment scene, mentions being pure of vegetation, which scholars interpret as having properly observed religious laws regarding which plants could be eaten or used. Plants permeate Egyptian religious texts, showing how central they were to spiritual life. In later periods, this religious dimension of gardens continued but evolved. During the Ptolemaic period, as Greek ideas mixed with Egyptian traditions, some gardens became more philosophical spaces, places for contemplation and discussion like the gardens where Greek philosophers met with students, but they retained their sacred character. The sacred groves associated with temples remained important. New gods from the Greek pantheon were assigned their own sacred plants. Dionysus, god of wine, naturally became associated with grape cultivation. The old Egyptian wine associations with Osiris merged with Dionysian traditions, creating a blended religious botany. The Coptic Christians who emerged in Egypt in the first few centuries CE maintained some of these garden traditions while reinterpreting them through Christian theology. Monasteries had extensive gardens, continuing the tradition of temple gardens. Certain plants retained spiritual significance, but with new Christian meanings. The sycamore fig, for example, continued to be a sacred tree, but now associated with the Virgin Mary rather than Hathor. The underlying pattern persisted even as the specific religious context changed. For modern visitors to Egypt, the religious dimension of ancient gardens is largely invisible. We can see the physical remains, the pools and planting holes and irrigation channels. We can read about garden plants in ancient texts. But the spiritual atmosphere, the sense of being in a sacred space, the constant awareness of divine presence in the growing things around you, that's harder to recapture. Yet, it was fundamental to how the ancient Egyptians experienced their gardens. Understanding this helps us see these weren't just pretty spaces or useful food production areas. They were sacred landscapes, places where humanity, nature, and the divine all came together, where the cosmic dramas of death and rebirth, chaos and order were enacted daily in the behavior of plants. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Egyptian Gardens and Their Modern Echoes. What happened to the tradition of Egyptian gardens over the millennia, and what can we still learn from them today? As we bring our journey through ancient Egyptian gardens to a close, it's worth exploring how this horticultural heritage persisted, changed, and continues to resonate even in our modern world. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE brought significant changes to Egyptian society, but garden culture proved remarkably resilient. The Romans were themselves passionate gardeners, and they were impressed by what they found in Egypt. Roman writers describe Egyptian gardens with admiration, noting the sophisticated irrigation systems, the lush vegetation maintained despite the dry climate, and the integration of gardens into daily life. Roman villas in Egypt incorporated Egyptian garden design elements, particularly the central pool with surrounding plantings. The Romans brought their own garden styles, including more formal geometric layouts and a taste for topiary, the art of shaping plants through pruning. Egyptian gardeners adapted to these new aesthetics while maintaining traditional practices. Garden pools became more elaborate, sometimes lined with coloured tiles or decorated with mosaics. New plant species arrived, brought from other parts of the vast Roman Empire. Gardens in Roman Egypt became hybrid spaces, mixing local traditions with imported ideas. When Christianity became the dominant religion of Egypt in the 4th century CE, gardens took on new religious meanings, while maintaining much of their traditional form. Coptic monasteries established extensive gardens, necessary both for food production in isolated locations and as spaces for meditation and prayer. The monastery of St. Anthony, founded in the 4th century in Egypt's eastern desert, maintained gardens that were marvels of desert horticulture. Monks cultivated fruit trees, vegetables, and medicinal herbs in a harsh environment, using water from springs and wells, employing techniques that would have been familiar to ancient Egyptian gardeners thousands of years earlier. The Islamic conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE brought another layer of influence. Islamic garden design, with its emphasis on paradise gardens that echo descriptions of heaven in the Quran, found fertile ground in Egypt. The Islamic garden concept of the Chahar Bagh, the fourfold garden with water channels dividing the space into quadrants, had structural similarities to ancient Egyptian garden layouts. Both emphasized the importance of water, both used geometric organization, both connected gardens to spiritual concepts of paradise. In Islamic Cairo, from the Fatimid period onward, gardens flourished. The Fatimid caliphs were famous for their elaborate gardens, described in historical accounts as containing exotic plants from across the Islamic world. These gardens continued Egyptian traditions of collecting foreign plant species, of maintaining the garden as a status symbol and a mark of sophisticated civilization. The Ayyubid and Mamluk rulers who followed maintained these traditions. Garden pavilions where rulers could relax and conduct informal business were standard features of palaces. The agricultural landscape of Egypt continued to be shaped by techniques developed in antiquity. The shadoof remained the primary water-lifting device in rural areas well into the 20th century. Traditional irrigation methods, using gravity flow and careful water distribution, persisted. When European travellers and scholars visited Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, they documented agricultural and garden practices that were essentially unchanged from ancient times. This continuity is remarkable when you consider how much changed in other areas of life over those thousands of years. Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in 1798 brought along scholars and scientists who studied Egyptian agriculture and gardens with great interest. Their descriptions and drawings, published in the massive Description de l'Égypte, provide detailed documentation of Egyptian garden practices at the end of the 18th century. Reading these accounts, you can recognize techniques and layouts that would have been familiar to a New Kingdom gardener 3,000 years earlier. The expedition's botanists collected Egyptian plants, bringing seeds and specimens back to Europe, continuing the millennia-old tradition of plant exchange between Egypt and the Mediterranean world. The 19th century saw dramatic changes. Muhammad Ali Pasha, who ruled Egypt from 1805 to 1848, attempted to modernize Egyptian agriculture. He introduced new crops and new methods, some successful, others less so. He established botanical gardens in Cairo as centers for agricultural experimentation and education. These modern botanical gardens were conceptual descendants of the ancient temple gardens that had served similar purposes. The Cairo Zoo, established in 1891, included extensive botanical collections, continuing Egypt's tradition of plant collection and display. The 20th century brought the most dramatic changes in Egyptian agricultural history. The construction of the Aswan Low Dam in 1902 and especially the Aswan High Dam, completed in 1970, fundamentally altered Egypt's relationship with the Nile. The annual flood, which had governed life in Egypt for thousands of years, was stopped. The river became regulated, controlled, predictable. This brought many benefits, including year-round irrigation and protection from drought and excessive floods, but it also ended natural cycles that had renewed soil fertility and shaped Egyptian life since the beginning of civilization. Modern Egyptian gardens now use electric pumps instead of shadoofs. Chemical fertilizers have largely replaced organic composting. Exotic plants from around the world grow alongside traditional Egyptian species, yet many underlying patterns persist. The love of gardens remains strong in Egyptian culture. Those who can afford it maintain home gardens, and those who can't still keep potted plants, maintaining a connection to growing things. The garden as a domestic space, as a place of refuge from the hot, crowded city, as a source of fresh food and herbs, these functions continue. Archaeological work throughout the 20th and 21st centuries has revealed more about ancient gardens than any previous era knew. Excavations at sites like Amarna, Deir el-Medina, and Malkata have uncovered garden layouts with unprecedented detail. Scientific analysis of plant remains has identified species and varieties. Experimental archaeology has tested ancient techniques, building shadoofs and irrigation systems following ancient designs, planting gardens using ancient methods, confirming that these approaches really worked as we thought they did. This archaeological knowledge is now inspiring modern garden design. Landscape architects interested in sustainable, water-efficient gardens are looking at ancient Egyptian designs with new appreciation. The concept of the garden as an integrated ecosystem where water, plants, and space are carefully managed for maximum productivity with minimum waste. This ancient Egyptian approach is remarkably relevant to contemporary concerns about climate change and resource conservation. Several modern Egyptian gardens have been designed based on ancient principles. The gardens at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo attempt to recreate ancient plant collections. Some hotels and cultural centres have built gardens inspired by ancient designs, with central pools, papyrus and lotus plantings, and shade trees arranged as they would have been thousands of years ago. These aren't exact replicas. We don't have detailed enough information to recreate any specific ancient garden precisely, but they capture the spirit and incorporate the fundamental design principles. Beyond Egypt, the influence of Egyptian garden design can be traced through history. The Persian paradise gardens, which influenced Islamic garden design, which in turn influenced European gardens during the Renaissance, these all have threads connecting back to ancient Egypt. The concept of the garden as an ordered space separate from wild nature, the use of water features as central organizing elements, the spiritual significance attached to garden spaces, these are all ideas that appeared in ancient Egypt and then spread and evolved throughout world garden history. In contemporary sustainable agriculture, some ancient Egyptian techniques are being reconsidered. Organic composting, crop rotation, companion planting, water-efficient irrigation. These practices that the Egyptians developed by necessity are now being adopted by choice as alternatives to industrial agriculture's chemical inputs and water waste. Research stations are testing traditional crop varieties, including ancient grains and vegetables, finding that some are more disease-resistant or drought-tolerant than modern hybrids. Knowledge preserved in Egyptian seed banks includes varieties that trace back centuries or even millennia. The medical uses of Egyptian garden plants continue to be studied. Modern pharmacology has confirmed the efficacy of many traditional remedies. Research continues on plants mentioned in ancient Egyptian medical texts, sometimes discovering new medicinal properties that the ancients might have known about but couldn't articulate in modern biochemical terms. Garlic's cardiovascular benefits, aloe's healing properties, willow bark's pain relief. These validated uses have led scientists to take other ancient claims more seriously. Investigating plants the Egyptians used for purposes modern medicine hasn't yet confirmed. For home gardeners today, particularly those in dry climates similar to Egypt's, ancient Egyptian techniques offer practical solutions. The shadoof design principle, using counterweights to reduce the work of lifting water, can be adapted for modern gardens. The idea of mulching and soil improvement through composting is fundamentally the same approach Egyptians used. The practice of creating microclimates within a garden, using structures and larger plants to shelter smaller ones, this is exactly what permaculture designers recommend today and what Egyptian gardeners practiced thousands of years ago. The spiritual dimension of Egyptian gardens also resonates today, though in different ways. The contemporary movement toward mindful gardening, toward viewing garden work as meditation and spiritual practice, echoes the Egyptian understanding of gardening as a sacred act. The recognition that contact with plants and natural growth cycles benefits mental health. This is something Egyptians knew intuitively. They saw the garden as a place of healing for both body and spirit, a view that modern garden therapy and horticultural therapy programs are rediscovering and validating through scientific research. Climate change makes ancient Egyptian agricultural knowledge particularly relevant. As more regions face water scarcity and higher temperatures, the techniques that let Egyptians garden successfully in a desert environment become models for adaptation. International development programs working in arid regions are sometimes incorporating traditional Egyptian irrigation methods, finding they work better than high-tech solutions in contexts where maintenance and resources are limited. The shadoof, that ancient device, is being reintroduced in some areas where electric pumps failed because electricity was unreliable or fuel was unaffordable. The garden as a concept, as a human creation that mediates between civilization and nature, remains fundamentally relevant. We still create gardens for the same reasons ancient Egyptians did: for food, for beauty, for a connection to living things, for spiritual solace. The specific plants may differ, the tools may be more advanced, but the underlying human need that gardens fulfill is unchanged. We still find peace sitting beside water, watching things grow, eating food we've cultivated ourselves. These experiences connect us across millennia to those ancient Egyptian gardeners working their shadoofs at dawn, tending their vegetables in the evening cool, sitting under their sycamore figs, contemplating mortality and rebirth. What lessons can we take from ancient Egyptian gardens as we conclude our journey? Perhaps the most important is the value of patience and observation. Egyptian garden knowledge wasn't developed quickly. It accumulated over thousands of years, each generation learning from the previous one, adding their own observations, passing the enriched knowledge forward. They watched plants carefully, noted what worked and what didn't, adjusted their practices accordingly. This patient, empirical approach led to deep understanding. Another lesson is integration. Egyptian gardens weren't single-purpose spaces. They provided food, medicine, beauty, shade, spiritual connection, social space, all at once. This multifunctional approach made gardens central to life rather than marginal. Modern gardens often specialize, vegetable gardens separate from ornamental ones, with little overlap. The Egyptian approach suggests benefits to integration, to designing spaces that serve multiple needs simultaneously. The Egyptian understanding that gardens require continuous care and attention is another relevant lesson. Gardens don't maintain themselves. They need daily observation, regular watering, constant weeding, seasonal planting, and harvesting. This isn't a burden to resent, but a form of engagement with living systems, a practice that connects you to the cycles of growth and death that govern all life. The ancient Egyptians didn't see garden work as drudgery. It was life, essential and meaningful. Finally, there's the Egyptian recognition that gardens are places where human and natural and divine all meet. Whether or not we share their specific religious beliefs, we can appreciate the sense that gardens are special spaces, different from both wild nature and built structures, places where we participate in processes larger than ourselves. A garden is where we plant a seed and watch, day by day, as it becomes a plant that feeds us or flowers that bring beauty. We didn't create the life in that seed. We just provided conditions for it to manifest. That's a humbling and wonderful thing, and it connects us to the gardeners of ancient Egypt who felt the same wonder 3,000 years ago. As you settle into sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself in an ancient Egyptian garden at twilight. The day's heat is fading. The lotus flowers in the pool are closing for the night. Date palms rustle softly overhead. The irrigation channels murmur with water. The scent of herbs fills the air. Somewhere, a hoopoe bird calls. You sit on a low bench, comfortable, tired from the day's work but satisfied. The garden surrounds you, alive and growing, a pocket of life and order that you've created and maintained. Tomorrow you'll return to care for it again, and it will continue to care for you, feeding your body and soul. This was the gift of the ancient Egyptian garden, and in understanding it, we've received that gift across the vast gulf of time. May it bring you peaceful rest tonight, and may you carry something of that ancient botanical serenity with you into tomorrow.